happy to introduce the panel called Europe After Putin. Interesting. A new security order for the 21st century. William Drozdiak, Global Europe Fellow, Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Welcome. Please give them a round of applause because we are 5 now. There was one-on-one earlier this day, so we'll have an intensive discussion. So Mr. Drozdiak here, Julia de Clerck-Sachsse, visiting senior fellow with German Marshall Fund. Welcome, Julia. On my left, Wilhelm Molterer, chairman of the board of directors of GLOBSEC. Welcome. Then Suzanne Lynch, chief Brussels correspondent and associate editor of POLITICO Belgium. Welcome. And last but certainly not least, from Greece, Ioannis Grigoriadis, associate professor and Jean Monnet chair, senior fellow with Hand program of Turkey, Bilkent University, ELIAMEP, Turkey. Welcome. So, I'll pass the ball to Wilhelm first. What does that mean after Putin? We saw the other day that Joe Biden decided to run for the re-election. We live in a war with Russia, what we heard. How would you frame after Putin?
Well, Timothy Gordon Ash has closed with a quote of Antonio Gramsci. I will start with the quote of Antonio Gramsci. He said, "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now it is time for monsters." That's what we are facing now. There is a Russia existing post-Putin. Nobody knows which Russia this will definitely be. The only thing that I know, and I think I'm quite on the safe side by saying, this is a Russia that is extremely, I would say, oriented towards a new axis with Beijing, with China. This is a Russia that is turning away from Europe. This is a Russia that keeps, let's say, an autocratic approach, at least for the foreseeable time. What is happening in Russia post-Putin, nobody knows. That's reality. Which leads me to for me, even more important question. What is our reaction, our European reaction? And I would make several points. First, yes, we can be proud that what we have achieved over the last couple of months, we are acting united, we are acting fast, we are acting strong. But the challenges, as Timothy had said, are ahead. And I would see some of them really, really important. First, 23 of 27 EU member states are NATO members, which means we need to strengthen the European pillar within NATO. That's for me a critical element, which leads to a second very important thing. We have to invest heavily into security and defense. Without having the strong pillar on that, European NATO pillar, and investment into security and defense, the European Union will not play the global role we want to play. Third element, I see the strategic autonomy of the European Union rather critical, to be quite honest. Even if I understand the concept of the strategic autonomy concerning energy, foodstuff, and you name it, I would love to translate this concept into strategic responsibility. Because if you are not feeling yourself as Europe strong, proud, and responsible for the global dimension, we have potentially the risk to be just inward looking. Responsibility is for me the name of the game. For doing that, we need enormous investment. I think we should talk about the investment into R, D, and I. If you look what happens globally, we are at risk that we lose our economic, let's say, competence and capacity, and we do not increase our power in defense and security. Investment into RDI. Look what happens in the United States now. Isn't this a wake-up call, a brutal wake-up call for the European Union to invest, to attract private? We have to turn our future into sustainability, which has 3 dimensions for me. The one is to be competitive. The second is to be active on the climate front, and the third to have a cohesion, a society that keeps things together. And last but not least, the strategic global strategy or the global strategy of the European Union. A clear yes to enlargement of the European Union towards the Western Balkan countries, a clear yes and an active role in engaging the Ukraine as member of the European Union and going even beyond, taking, for instance, Moldova into account as one of the most endangered countries in this region. We have to make a clear statement concerning our transatlantic partnership on equal footing. This is for me key. And we have to be open to other partners in the world. Is it Turkey? Is it the Asian region? Is it, you name it, for instance, Australia? Last but not least, one blind spot of the European Union, and here I'm extremely concerned, is Africa. We leave Africa for being active, for being the Chinese active there, for being the Russians active, and the Arabic world to be active if we are not there.
Thank you so much for framing the conversation. We'll continue. Suzanne, some say that any ceasefire or peace agreement with basically unreconstructed Russia will be inherently unstable. So they also say that either Ukraine wins or Europe loses. So what's the Brussels perspective on this?
I think the Ukrainian government have been making that point all along, it's not just, we're not just fighting for Ukraine, we're fighting for Europe. We're physically, geographically on that edge. But I think, going back to the title of this session, I think what it has changed in terms of thinking about a post-Putin future, of course there will be a post-Putin future, is that it has forced Europe to confront its economic dependencies on Russia. And so much of the conversation about Europe's geopolitical role, ideas about security, are actually rooted in money, in trade, in economics. And the war in Ukraine forced Europe, particularly Germany, and other countries that had built up this dependency on Russian gas to reconsider this, to change this, and they have quicker than a lot of people would have thought. And of course, we're now having this new debate now that's really become the prominent debate in Brussels about China now, and has Europe, or is it in danger of building up those same dependencies? But just to pick up on Wilhelm's point there about, which I think is now going to be the next big challenge, watching this in Brussels, is going to be the issue of accession for Ukraine, both to NATO, and this is going to be a big topic at the NATO summit in Vilnius this summer, but also accession to the EU. And I think Ukraine is going to be disappointed. I cannot see, and maybe we'll be coming back next year and having this discussion, but I think it's been a very interesting development over the last week or so in Brussels. I don't know if people have been following this, but there was a uproar among certain countries about an influx of Ukrainian grain into Eastern Europe. And this was from the countries that have been most closest allies to Ukraine, so countries like Poland, for example. And I think this has given us a little taste of the realities of Ukrainian membership for the EU. The grand ideals of opening up Europe and putting Ukraine at the heart of Europe's future have collided with economic realities. And we have seen farmers' groups in a lot of these countries protest because it's flooded their markets and brought down the price of grain. And I think this is a very good encapsulation of the reality of enlargement and the prospect of admitting a country with more than 40 million people, a huge geographical expanse. I think some countries in the West are worried about a kind of Polish-Ukrainian bloc in the East, now that we've seen an emboldened East in the European Union. I think these kind of issues are going to be a problem for the EU, and with all the talk of accession, I just can't see that happening anytime soon, and I think that's going to be one of the major fault lines and problems for the EU as we start thinking about a post-Putin Russia and a post-Putin, post-war Europe.
And unfortunately, we see that we are already entering the election cycle, both in Europe and in the US, and it's always a burden for the democracies, as we heard before. I want to pass it to William, maybe to pick up on something that we heard already on previous talks. I find amazing that you wrote basically 2 books that they're in the heart of today's discussion that we're having. The last one is The Last President of Europe. It's your talks with Emmanuel Macron, and the one previous to this was basically about Europe's future, Europe, the fractured continent. So when you put 2 pieces together at this moment and maybe comment on what Macron was saying both about Russia and China and the concept of strategic autonomy, where will you put this new security order already for the 22nd century in that framework?
Thank you. Yes, I've had several hours of conversation with President Macron over the past year to discuss the idea of a new security order in the 21st century, looking beyond the current conflict in Ukraine and trying to assess what will be the new geopolitical contours that we face. And being only 45 years old, he's a man who thinks about the future. Africa counts a lot for him. He makes the point that 1 in 3 human beings will be African by the end, later in this century, that the terrible afflictions of war and drought are felt perhaps in no other place. So my new book, which is called Europe After Putin, the New Security Order for the 21st Century, will focus on the challenges facing Europe and also the United States. I believe that with the United States looking more and more toward the Indo-Pacific, already we're pouring considerable amount of resources into shoring up the alliances that we have with South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, which is very important because the northern Philippines will be the new naval base that the United States will use to try to contain China's ambitions. And lastly, AUKUS, the relationship with Australia, the UK, and now France, which has been brought in because France has 5 military bases in the Indo-Pacific with, to mainly deal with their 2 million citizens there, but France remains the only European power with a significant military presence in the Indo-Pacific. With these new considerations, I believe it's only natural that the United States, regardless of who we elect as president next year, will start to shift its attention and resources toward this part of the world. It won't leave Europe. We will still remain an important residual actor, but it'll be all the more important for Europe to step up and start taking care of its own responsibilities. And this is what I believe is the central message behind what Emmanuel Macron has been saying really for the last few years since he's been in office, that given the resurgence of big power rivalry in the world today, Europe risks being picked off by Russia, China, and the United States in the years to come unless it develops the capabilities to stand up for its own interests. He said we could soon face a situation with the growing partnership between Russia and China dominating the Eurasian continents and thus leaving Europe only as a tiny peninsula on the western part. And for the United States, as our chief economic rival, besides being China, is also in trade with Europe. And the big concern in Macron's recent conversations with President Biden was, will the new American legislation under the Inflation Reduction Act suck investment out from big companies in Europe? And we're already seeing that today. BASF, the world's biggest chemicals maker based in Germany, says all future investments will be now focused on the United States, where energy is cheaper and profitable markets are more present. So what should Europe focus on in a new order? I believe it has to concentrate on 3 fronts. Of course, there will be the Eastern Front and what to do about Russia in the post-conflict situation. There, Poland will have an important role to play, and they're already greatly increasing their military strength. Second will be the Arctic, and bringing Finland and Sweden into NATO is an important step for the West in terms of protecting the shipping lanes in the Arctic. Already, with the melting of the Arctic ice cap, we see that the shipping time between Europe and Asia has been cut by 1 week for those who are using the Arctic shipping lanes. So that's important. And finally, the Southern Front, which I think is very much preoccupying Macron's mind right now. He pointed out that today, because of drought and war, 50 million people get their daily sustenance from Lake Chad. Within 15 years, that lake will dry up, and those 50 million people will have to move and move fast. And the big fear on his part is that there will be a tsunami of immigrants coming across the Mediterranean from Africa, and not just Africa, also the larger Middle East. Iran is suffering through terrible drought that is making many parts of its country uninhabitable. So as we see the effects of climate change take more and more of make more and more of a serious impact on our lives, we're going to have to adapt our defense institutions. And it's also important to make sure that we have the support and loyalty of the younger generation. And for them, I think there's no other issue more important than climate change.
Thank you for fantastic input, William. Julia, we saw that war basically had a unifying effect for the transatlantic alliance, but we also see cracks, and we had doubts about it also previously of this. So how do you see potential concerning that we have 2024 in perspective, election year, and possible fallouts out of this concerning Europe's own dilemmas on its own security umbrella?
Thanks so much. Well, given that we're in Delphi and in Greece, I think in answering your question, I'm going to be part Pollyanna and part Cassandra. But I'll start with the good news first. As you said, I mean, especially at the beginning of the war, I think it's really been, we've heard this already from previous panelists, it's really been a wake-up call for Europeans, for the transatlantic alliance. So it's given a boost to unity within the West. And yet at the same time, we also see that by upping the geopolitical stakes, if you will, it's kind of increased the potential for fallout. So if you're looking at security cooperation within Europe, I think as someone who's worked on that personally and followed for many decades, you did see that Europe really moved from sort of adding ever more sort of pieces to the acronym soup of Brussels. It's really started to use some of the instruments that it had creatively, effectively, fast, by using, for example, the European Peace Facility to procure and arm Ukrainians. That's really something that's unheard of. We've talked about the Zeitenwende in Germany, but I think there's been a Zeitenwende all throughout Europe in their assessment of what needs to be done and how urgently it needs to be done on defense. And so this wake-up call has in many ways had a positive impact. NATO's enlarging. More EU members are now also parts of NATO, so there's a greater coherence there. The EU is enlarging. We already heard that. It's reversed a trend, so to say, with Brexit, that the EU might be shrinking, that now there's a perspective for the EU growing again, even, and we've also heard that already, that path will be long and cumbersome, but it's on the horizon. Across the Atlantic, President Biden has made a firm commitment to the Ukrainian war effort, but also to the transatlantic alliance, something, again, we didn't always take for granted with the previous administration. And then I think there's also been a sense of sort of Western unity rallying behind a new urgency to defend democracy, something they've really kind of been doubting, that's in crises, which has given a new sense of unity across the Atlantic. So I think if you looked, especially at the beginning, if you look at last February, March, there was this real sense that out of this tragedy of the invasion of Ukraine and the willingness of the Ukrainian people to really push back, maybe a stronger and more united West would rise, that's really kind of found its new mojo to stand up for itself. And yet, by upping the geopolitical stakes of this conflict, I think there's also an increasing risk now of division, both within the European camp, but also across the Atlantic. The first piece is China, of course. China, by aligning itself with Russia, has really kind of turned this into a geopolitical confrontation. And therefore, on one hand, maybe united the West in pushing back against aggression, standing up for territorial integrity. But aligning around Russia is one thing, aligning around China is quite another for the transatlantic relations. Even within Europe, and I think the recent Macron visit to Beijing is an example of that, how quickly a united front, let's not forget he traveled together with Commission President von der Leyen, can actually crumble, and at the end of this visit, you have a picture that looks quite different as the initial purpose of the visit, right? There's also the question of the West versus the rest, right? I mean, European and transatlantic partners were still quite surprised that maybe the rest of the world did not always see this kind of newfound mojo for democratic support in the same way, might be looking at this more as a regional conflict, might be seeing this as something that detracts from other important conflicts around the world, other important geographic areas. We've heard Africa, we've heard the Middle East, and so on. I think it leads us to a problem of the narrative. The narrative of democracy is not something that really stands up around the globe. It's often seen as something that's talking down to the rest of the world. We've heard earlier, I mean, a support for sovereignty, a support for international law is maybe something that can rally the rest of the world behind this conflict again and tie it to the bigger political picture. Lastly, the domestic picture. I think something we've heard echoes of this already. Hugely important, of course, elections next year, you heard it, but already elections this year. Let's not forget Poland, a total Russia hawk, is now blocking the imports of Ukrainian grain because of support for their farmers. Pretty much every single EU member state and the United States have these domestic concerns to take into account. And I think there's also huge potential, unfortunately, for divisions in this greater alliance.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Ioannis, I'm going to put the last thing on the table and then we are going to have a free fall. When we talk about security and security order towards the 22nd century, we still are with Putin. We don't have to wait after Putin. We're in this situation at the moment. The concept of security, cyber resilience, digital resilience, green transition, energy resilience and transformation, rare earths, which is strategic objective and question for Europe in that regard. We heard already from Wilhelm and William and Suzanne and Julia, migration, demography, democracy challenge for Europe as such, and human security in terms of, you know, natural disasters that we already see across the continent. How to put it all into perspective with the war going on and with geography that will not change. Russia will stay where it is, whatever happens, and, you know, so can you just put it on the table and we can talk then? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I do think that the war, Russia's invasion in Ukraine, has highlighted the significance of working together on addressing security challenges, not just hard security concerns, but also soft security concerns, and all the security concerns that are going to affect our lives in Europe and the world in the 21st century. In that respect, Europe's initiative to introduce the Green Deal, the whole discussion about how to mainstream the environment policy into all our policies and bring environmental security to the forefront is particularly important. But in that respect, I do think that in order to better grasp this transition, we'll really need to rethink some of the concepts that Wilhelm also introduced. This concept of strategic autonomy and responsibility need to be thought very well together. I also agree that the word autonomy may be misunderstood. In my understanding, strategic autonomy doesn't mean defining Europe against the United States, quite the opposite. Autonomy means that the European Union becomes an asset to the United States even beyond Europe, so like in the Indo-Pacific, in other security challenges that the United States needs some European support, it is important to be there. And I do think that responsibility is a concept that needs to be taken very seriously. And when it comes to regional conflicts as well, I think that one of the big critiques against the European security policy was its complacency against a number of frozen conflicts, issues that we never touched upon, thinking that this is difficult, this is not going to affect us anytime, and then these conflicts get unfrozen and then affect us in profound ways. So being proactive and being strategic in this is particularly important. And I do think that these issues, of course, have strong environmental dimensions as well. We heard about Lake Chad. You may think of another plenty of sort of soft spots, environmental soft spots around Europe that are going to affect profound European security, not least because of migration, as we said. If migration is already shaping European politics in such a profound way, and we don't have convincing answers, both domestically and internationally, this is only going to get worse in the upcoming decade. So in that respect, we need to be very, very careful. And we also need to build on our transatlantic relationship. I think that's enormously important to remember, that if Europe and the United States want to be leading actors in the 21st century, they can only do this together. And I think Brexit is a good example why the opposite cannot work, as we now know. So working on these issues and trying to bring more European strategic responsibility on a number of conflicts around Europe. And of course, we know now Crimea and Ukraine, unfortunately, Europe was too late and offered too little, right? Hopefully, it will offer much more in the near term, but there are other disputes, Transnistria or Karabakh, disputes in Africa, like we live through Sudan now, like what is happening there. There are a lot of very fragile states, and there we need to be working together in a very proactive manner to show that our responsibility for the 21st century is going to help both Europe and the world at the same time.
Fantastic. So Zelensky and Xi, for those who didn't hear, spoke today for an hour. Zelensky said it was a long and meaningful conversation. Nothing else came out of it. Today is also 37th anniversary of Chernobyl, 26th of April. Wilhelm, do you think nuclear option is on the table? This is quiz question, yes or no?
As long as this technology is available, we have to work under the assumption that it could be used. I will not exclude.
Suzanne, yes or no? And what do you think is still the biggest security?
Well, I think that this was such the huge concern in the first few months of the war. This was the tightrope that NATO was trying to walk the whole time. It's why they were worried that if they went too far, that this could move or trigger some kind of nuclear attack. That didn't happen. And we've seen NATO and the West pull off this balancing act, which is arm Ukraine to the hilt, give it as much more money than a lot of people expected to do, and yet not send in troops on the ground. And they somehow managed to keep that very, very delicate balance, and it's so far kind of worked. So
I would think along the same lines, in the sense that trying to communicate resolve and determination without triggering development that would result in this awful incident is the best way.
Julia?
Yeah, absolutely. I think on this we're all aligned on this panel. I mean, the nuclear shadow is clearly over this conflict, and it is a balancing act which hopefully will hold.
So what, besides the natural causes, can be after Putin, or when can be after Putin, and what can be still with Putin in that regard concerning the developments that we're witnessing?
You mean in terms of the nuclear threat, or?
I passed another question to you to start the background.
Vladimir Putin's been in power for 23 years. There are rumors that he's ill. I tend to doubt that. But I think his circle is shrinking more and more. And at some point, as we've learned with the fate of autocracies in the past, as somebody who covered the fall of the Shah of Iran, we were talking about how invulnerable he seemed to be right up until the weeks before he left power. And autocracies tend to shatter like glass at a certain point, and I think that could happen to Putin as well. When, we just don't know. But I think if the war if he becomes so desperate, depending on how effective the forthcoming counteroffensive will be by Ukraine, and given the demoralization of his forces and the great consternation in the Soviet and the Russian military about the fate of their institution, I think he could face a rebellion from within.
And after that, Wilhelm, what can we expect? Because it's always the issue of Russia within itself.
Well, there is a Russia post-Putin existing, definitely, but nobody knows what Russia this will be and how this will look like. We have to be, let's say, flexible enough to react. But what is crystal clear for me, the European Union has to have the ambition to play a global role. Because what we currently are doing is we want to play the global role, but we are delegating to somebody else, washing their hands without getting wet. That's over, baby. Full stop. First. Second, I think we have to be crystal clear. If we want to have a global role, then we have to take global responsibility. You cannot have a role without responsibility. And this has to go far beyond the climate issue, because the climate is the nice one. But there are others if you want to be responsible. One key issue is European Union is part, most of the member states are part of the NATO umbrella, but this needs to be developed to a, let's say, stronger European aspect or approach into the NATO structure. Second, we shouldn't be just the good guys if we are talking about climate change and the global responsibility. We have to take also responsibility for other issues than just the nice ones. That means defense and security is crystal clear. And last but not least, we should stop talking, we should start acting if it comes, for instance, to Africa. Because if we are complaining that the Russians are there, that the Chinese are there, there is a reason. We are not there because we are not courageous enough to be there. We have responsibility for that. If we want to play this global role, we have to take global responsibility. Otherwise, it will not fly. To wash the hands without getting wet, it's over, baby. And I think this we have to to tell also to our citizens. If we want to have a global role, we have to take global responsibility. Full stop.
Susan, what
Yeah, just coming on, picking up on some of the points that you made earlier as well. I agree. This whole sea change that we've seen in terms of EU defence policy, and for the first time, we've seen the use of the European Peace Facility, that fund to send arms to Ukraine. But again, I think that what's so unique about the European Union is that it is a collection of 27 countries, and it's its own worst enemy in the sense that you're already seeing pushback from national capitals who are really not that comfortable about Brussels, quote unquote, taking responsibility for EU defence. So they're talking about joint procurement now and joint defence industry. But we're already seeing in these kind of boring meetings that go on in Brussels and faceless corridors, very important decisions are made. And one of those is about, like, for example, one of the debates now is, like, should it just be EU defence companies that are included? It won't be a surprise for people in this room to name names. France, for example, big defence producer. Now the debate's about, well, what about if some companies, European companies, have operations elsewhere? Should they be included? So you have those kind of problems that I think are going to constrain this move towards defence union. And second of all, picking up the point about Africa, just a kind of side point, on the European Peace Facility, what I'm hearing in Brussels is it's quite an interesting angle. Even though it's pretty much agreed people want to help Ukraine, there have been murmurs of kind of discontent about the use of this European Peace Facility. That what about the other conflicts? What about Africa? That this fund that was supposed to be kind of, was never, predated the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, has now been kind of co-opted, and the European Union is in panic mode saying, oh, we need to do something, let's just kind of take this off the shelf. And some people are asking around the EU table, validly, well, hang on, this was supposed to be for other conflicts too, and they're just, it's just becoming a crisis mechanism. without being something that's more thought through. So I think all these questions are going to be kind of hopefully ironed out, but at least debated over the next few months and years. And I think we're still a long way then from this idea that you're saying is beginning, but still a lot of kind of bumps in the road.
Fantastic. William, you've mentioned very important thing, that is new generation. We talk about, next generation mechanism, 2050 European Green Strategy, but we have a huge, and we had, crisis of democracy and Putin's weaponization of, let's call it, values. He's playing that card all over the world, and Russia played it in dismantling European democracy. So what can Europe do more in that regard concerning what Russia has been playing out?
Well, I think the big hope for the future of Russia is its younger population. Now, many of them, of course, have scattered to neighboring countries, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Germany, wherever. But at some point, this diaspora will come back when the laws of life and death catch up with Vladimir Putin. And I think there is a unified view among young Russians and also young Europeans about the need to adapt to the challenges of our climate. And this is why I emphasize climate change, and not just in a axiomatic or pablum, but serious challenges that we need to respond to and adapt our institutions like the EU and NATO to dealing with them in a way that shows that we're making effective progress, and thus we can win the support and loyalty of our younger generation.
And we have to wrap up because the concept was that you have introductory words and then we have a round of conversation. Julia, so will the end of the war shape our peace and security order, and basically can you envisage the end game of the war in Ukraine?
I think it's a bit early. I'm not going to speculate about. I hope so.
We're speculating after
Putin. We're all
Putin,
working towards the end of this war, and I think it's incredibly important that already now, and it is being done, we focus on what would happen. On one hand, of course, preparing for the rebuilding of Ukraine. As you know, there's a lot of work going on already on that, but also as we've heard from William, working with the Russian diaspora, supporting Russian civil society and so on. Putin is not Russia, so making sure those elements are there. There are obviously structures for working with Russia, both within NATO and the European Union, so these structures are there. It's premature to reactivate them now, but they're there. I think the more important picture will be also to keep the global confrontation between China and the US will not go away, and that's within, this conflict is taking place within that. So we have to really remember that, and that's a crucial question for the Europeans. Where do they fit in to that picture? And the answer to the end of the war in Ukraine will not answer that questions. And the last one, I think, is this tension in the global versus the domestic. I mean, we've heard a lot, Europe needs to be a global actor. Of course it does, but there are so many pressures on Europe right now that this conflict has brought to the fore, and I think keeping that balancing act, while at the same time keeping the geopolitical balancing act, will remain a huge challenge for the future.
Just a quick point to add what Julia is saying. I think the importance of demographic trends is reflected in looking at China. If China has an Achilles heel, it's in the demographics and the shrinking population, the young people, and the nature of the young people. Friends of mine who have spent a lot of time in China say this is a generation of spoiled brats that is coming up, because the one-child policy has been a social as well as a population disaster.
Ioannis.
I do agree that in a post-war environment, Russia will be weaker, and there will be a vacuum that the European Union has to fill, strategically speaking. This is very important. I mentioned the conflict zones in the Black Sea and beyond. We also talked about how Russia has been involved in the Middle East, in Africa, in several regions around the world where the European Union has stronger interests, economic and other, but hasn't developed strategic interest and strategic presence. So in that respect, I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. And in addition to that, it is also very important to develop a multi-level strategy towards Russia so that the civil society, the youth, is treated in a profoundly different way, so that they understand that Europe is not the enemy, it's a partner. And this is something to keep in mind so that we can consider a new future.
Well, yeah, as I say, I think one of the conversations about reconstruction is, there's lots of talk about another Marshall Plan, and I think the G7 format is going to be important here and how the EU interacts with that, the role of the US, Japan, etc. And I think that's one to watch. And then I think the EU, as well, getting back to that economic theme, I think it was a kind of a late starter when it came to investment in Africa. It's got this global gateway plan, but obviously China has managed to use money effectively to gain leverage in a lot of countries around the world. I think the EU is late to that game. I'm going to be interested to see how that plays out in the next few years, if it can make those inroads using investment with strings attached, which is, I think, what the EU should do, not just give free money and shut its eyes to what's going on. But it has been late to the party there, but if that comes through, you could see some possibility of the EU making those kind of stronger, deeper links with regions in Africa, for example.
And we have to finish what Wilhelm said. It's over, baby, so all aboard. Yeah? Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.